I guess that's over to me. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming to the Strand. It's been a while since I've been here. I moved back to New York a year ago from 8 years in Beijing. Louisa and I crossed paths there, had lots of friends in common, and it's really nice to see that there are folk here in New York who are interested in our lives back there and the lives of 1.4 billion people at this point and their history, and a really, remarkable event in their history that frankly we should consider ours as well. That's my personal opinion. As our kind introduction explained, I'm the managing editor of ChinaFile, which is the online magazine of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. We do text, video, photography, and we encourage you to visit us at ChinaFile.com. Thank you very much. Louisa, a warm welcome back to U.S. or to the East Coast. You've been in Michigan for a while.
That's right. And I'd really like to thank the Strand for hosting this event. I was just going to tell you a quick and really quite tangential story, but this is only the second time that I've ever been to this bookstore, and I'm really hoping that it won't be as humiliating as the first time that I came here, because I came here several years ago with a group of friends, and we had met in Beijing. We'd all been students there studying Chinese in 1991, and before we arrived we had this view that we'd get to China, we'd make all these friends, we'd hang out with all the Chinese students, and it would be such fun. And then we got there and it was still the post-Tiananmen era, and there was a great deal of kind of fear, just basically fear among Chinese students, and we found it really, really difficult to make friends. So we used to spend a lot of time with each other playing quite elaborate practical jokes on each other. And then many years passed and I came to New York, and one of my Beijing friends brought me to the Strand bookstore. He said, I know you love bookstores, you've got to go to this one. It's the best in New York. So we get here, and then he said, I wonder whether you could help me. But there's a book that I really want to read, and I'm just too embarrassed to ask for it. And I was like, fine, of course I will, what is it? And he said, can you ask them for the Cliff Notes version of Ulysses? And of course I didn't know what Cliff Notes was. I'm British. I thought it was like the Arden edition of Shakespeare or something. I had no idea. So I went up to the counter and I said, do you have the Cliff Notes version of Ulysses? And I just got such a look of disdain. The person behind the counter said, we're really sorry, we don't carry Cliff Notes. And my friend was doubled over in the aisle, weeping. So Dave Hogan,
welcome.
I'm hoping that it's not going to be as humiliating today as that experience. Thank you for that, Dave.
We'll try to make sure it's not. I'm going to try to avoid the humiliation of forgetting the name of your book.
Oh, that happens all the time.
I gather, you explained that a couple of press interviews you've done recently, you had a couple of people forget the title of the book, and there might have been some sort of Pavlovian response. If you have the word amnesia in the title, it's impossible to remember. This book is remarkable. It talks about a lot of energy expended trying to forget something, something that affected a lot of people. And I wonder if you could tell us when you first came to understand the gravity of how much energy was being expended and how that made you feel. I mean, you just talked about being there in 91, but like, when did you first grasp that people really didn't want to talk about it?
Well, I mean, back in 1991, it was very clear that it was a subject that really had changed the lives of our friends, the people who later became our friends. We did make friends, but it did take months and months and months. And the people who we were friends with were being sent off to military camp in the holidays, compulsory military camp. And it also took a very long time for them to talk about what had happened only 2 years ago at that point. It was really towards the end of that year that people began telling us their stories, and it was not in public. It would always be, in a park walking where there was no one around us, where there was no one listening, or in a really, really crowded place. It certainly would not be in our university or in our dorms or in their dorms, because we all believed at that point that we were being monitored and that topics like that would get people into trouble. So it was very early on that I had that realization. I mean, you've been in China a long time too. When did it happen for you?
I first went in 1997. I was working in book publishing, and an author I had under contract to write a book about what it was like to publish an illegal English language magazine in Beijing. It's a magazine called Beijing Scene.
Oh, I worked for that magazine.
I remember.
In fact, I wrote almost every article in some of the issues under different names.
I didn't know what I was getting into, but this young American who by that time had been there 10 years at least, in 97. Actually, I guess he'd been there longer, maybe 15 years at that point, was going to write a book about what it was like to run an illegal magazine. And he was late delivering his manuscript, so I convinced the publisher, as a dispensable junior editor here in New York, to let me go take over the editing of his magazine so he could finish his book. And I arrived on the train in Beijing from Hong Kong, this pre-speed train, so it was a 33-hour journey. And I arrived in Beijing on June 3rd, 1997, and while I was coming up on the train, the police had confiscated absolutely everything in his office. So he wasn't there to pick me up at the train station, and I barely spoke Chinese at all at the time, and sort of finally found my way to his office building where the security guard sort of signaled, "No, he's not here." And we found one another, and I spent the whole summer there watching him try to piece the office back together. And that was when it occurred to me that just being a vehicle for exchange of ideas, even if they were in English, and this magazine was the nexus for a lot of exchange between students studying English and foreigners who were studying Chinese, that was too dangerous around that period of the year. So that was when I first recognized it. Today, yesterday, June 4th, 25 years later, has the fear subsided?
I mean, I think that's what the really extraordinary thing has been about the government response this year, is it doesn't seem as if the fear has subsided. It seems as if the fear is even more real than ever before. If you look at the response, this year is the first time that we've seen people being detained for trying to commemorate Tiananmen behind closed doors in their own apartments. People have been criminally detained, ironically, for the offence of causing a public disturbance. As people have pointed out, it's difficult to cause a public disturbance in a private place. But according to Amnesty's the Chinese human rights group's latest figures, up to 100 people were detained in the run-up to June the 4th, and that's actually a higher figure than almost any year before. I think the repression this year, it started earlier and it lasted longer, and the people swept up were really extraordinary cases. I mean, there was one young guy who was, I think, a factory worker from Hubei, who was criminally detained for taking a selfie in Tiananmen Square. He took a picture of himself with his fingers in the V position. That was it. That was enough to get put in detention. So the government is, it seems, more scared than ever before about June the 4th than about any public discussion of it. And I mean, we even saw new blocks on Google this year, so that any discussion online just couldn't happen.
Quick question for all of you. Just by show of hands, how many people have been to Beijing? Wow, so most of you. All right. Yeah. So I don't really need to explain, but perhaps for the few who may not have been, Tiananmen Square is very, very large. And on a daily basis through the rest of the year, people take selfies and do this all the time. That's what Chinese tourists do. They go, I mean, it's like going to the Washington Monument. It's like going to, well, it's not like going to the Washington Monument. It's quite different, in fact, because there's open commemoration of all kinds of things, whereas in Tiananmen, can you describe it? Describe what's there.
What was there this year, if you tried to go on June the 4th, you would have found this immense space, but with security checkpoints at every corner. And in fact, ahead of June the 4th, all the foreign journalists, some of them were visited by police in their offices and told, do not go to the square, otherwise there will be consequences, unspecified consequences, of course, or don't write stories about June the 4th. But if as a foreigner you would try to go there on June the 4th, I heard people, someone told me they were frisked 3 times just walking around the square. Other people said they were having their passport, their ID cards checked numerous times. And I mean, when it comes to big political events like party congresses, the amount of security in the square is extraordinary. Now they have policemen carrying fire extinguishers just in case someone should try and self-immolate on the square, because of course it is such a symbol. It's the political and economic heart of China, and the Communist Party has appropriated that. It's, it was that during the time of the emperors and the Qing dynasty, and the Communist Party has taken on that mantle and has used it as such. And that's why I think this whole picture of almost a militarized zone, a small militarized zone where the square is, with policemen every few hundred meters, is so powerful, because it does say something about the mindset of the party.
Do you think that the number of detentions and arrests this year is in lockstep with the flow of information thanks to the internet?
I think it is in lockstep with that, but there are other factors as well. I mean, we have seen a great deal of unrest in China. The last year for which there were figures is 2010, and there were 180,000 protests in China around the country. And the issues were not necessarily the same as all of the issues that the students were protesting about in 1989. In 1989, there was calls for freedom and democracy, but there were also calls against corruption, against abuse of power, profiteering, and all of those are issues which really are more pressing than ever today, when we are having stories like, revelations like the family fortune of the former premier Wen Jiabao, which measured $2.7 billion. So I think a lot of the issues from 1989 remain so potent to the government, and they just worry that with all this unrest sort of flaring up in various places around the country, that could spark off something.
Your book does something remarkable that a lot of Tiananmen books before it have not, which is to focus not on Tiananmen, but on Chengdu, which is a city about 1,100 miles to the southwest of the capital in Sichuan province. And it's now a city of about 14 million people, I think, famous around the world for having been featured in Kung Fu Panda. Back then, in 89, I was sort of surprised to discover that the people with whom you spoke around the activism that occurred in Chengdu really came to it looking at protesting against corruption. And it was only late May, in very early June, that they'd heard word of the erection in Tiananmen in Beijing of the goddess of democracy statue, photos of which you guys will remember, that the words freedom and democracy started being bandied about in Chengdu. And I find it deeply ironic that, the government's current anti-corruption campaign is echoed in this sort of archaeological work you've done by digging up that in Chengdu. Can you tell us how you came to be looking at Tiananmen from this, remove and from this different angle?
Well, it was really by mistake, to be honest. It wasn't something that I had planned on when I started writing the book. It was something that I just stumbled across. So a lot of the time that I was writing the book, I was also doing my day job as an NPR correspondent. So I was out reporting stories in the day, and at night I would work on the book. And so I went to Chengdu to report a completely different story. And while I was there, I just happened to come across this woman called Tang Deying, who's 70 years old and has become a petitioner. So that's someone who is trying to seek justice from various government departments and seek retribution for an injustice that was done to her. And what had happened to her was that she had lost her son in 1989. He was 17 years old. He was bicycling home and he never came back. And she later found out that he'd been beaten to death in police custody. And she kept on and on and on and on asking what had happened to him. And after 11 years of asking, she was given a photograph of him, his body, by the police, and he was lying on a concrete floor, and you could just see his face. It's a slightly blurry picture, but you can see that he has been beaten. You can see blood around his nose. You can see his face is quite swollen. And it was clear that he had indeed, as she had been told, been beaten to death. And she just didn't quite understand how this could have happened. So I was curious, because I'd heard elsewhere there'd been trouble in Chengdu in 1989, but I'd never read anything about it. So I started kind of doing research the normal ways, Google. And one of the first things I came across was a letter that someone had written and that had been printed in the New York Times called Chengdu had its own Tiananmen Massacre. So I tracked down the person who'd written that letter.
And what year was that?
That was immediately after. That was like late June 1989, and it had been written by a professor of archaeology at Michigan University who had been in Chengdu at the time, and he'd written a report about what he'd seen. So he sent me the report, but he said, so long has passed and I'm getting old and I'm just not, I'm not sure about what I saw anymore. I'm not sure about what's in my report. So bit by bit, I started tracking down more and more people who were there, and I was asking them to give me their diaries, their photographs, any kind of documentary evidence that they could. And I ended up with just, boxes and boxes, 1,000 photographs from 1989 from Chengdu, including pictures of the huge demonstrations, the hunger strikes, on the morning of June the 4th, 1989, the massive demonstrations they held against the killings in Beijing, and then the subsequent violence in the crackdown, including pictures of the victims of violence, people with their heads cracked open, blood running down their face, this kind of thing. And then I started to look for other sort of corroborative evidence. So I was looking for primary sources. And the difference was that there was a US consulate in Chengdu, and it was in this hotel, the Jinjiang Hotel, where there were a lot of people who had seen this one particularly brutal incident. And I was actually I just was on fellowship in Michigan, and I was actually on an orientation tour of the library technology system, and I came across this database with all the diplomatic cables in it. So I just started typing things in, and suddenly all the cables from 1989 came up, including cables that had been sent from the people in Chengdu. So there was that, and then there was Chinese evidence as well. What happened?
Were these cables that came out from Bradley Manning? Do you have any idea whether these were part of that tranche of cables that were leaked?
No, they were cables that, they came out different ways. Some came out through WikiLeaks. Some came out because 25 years has already passed, and I think for some cables there's a statute, maybe 20 years, and then some were fired and were in the State Department reading room. I also tried putting in Freedom of Information requests, but I'm still waiting. I was number 1,198 in the queue.
As of this morning.
So they came a number of ways, but there was also, surprisingly, a lot of Chinese documentary evidence as well, because although you don't read about 1989 now in China, in the immediate aftermath it was quite different. They didn't deny what had happened. They just tried to control the information space. They tried to really just get their narrative across. So in Chengdu, they put out this book called The Whole Story of the Chengdu Riots, and they did it really fast. It came out in July 1989, so a month after the events, and they printed 700,000 copies. And so I had copies of this book, and I had newspaper reports from the time, and then I started just trying to put the pieces together.
I'm curious, did that book echo other propaganda that was coming out of the central government, or was it essentially delivered by the central government to the provincial governments for distribution?
Well, it was written by the provincial government, but a lot of the storyline was the same. It was the protests were not legitimate protests. There were counter-revolutionary riots, and that the turmoil that had happened in Chengdu was on a par with the turmoil that had happened in Beijing in terms of its seriousness, and that its effect had been as threatening to the provincial government in Sichuan as the turmoil in Beijing. So the message was the same, although some of the kind of the specifics of what had happened were different.
There's a stunning detail in your chapter about Chengdu about those who are detained in this particularly violent incident, which I'll let you go into if you wish. But one of the expatriates who's living in the hotel, who bears witness to this event, talks about hearing from another Chinese, I believe, that they're not protesting about anything in particular or attacking the hotel for anything other than their store of liquor and cigarettes, and that the hotel had become this symbol of foreign influence and wealth, which was exploited by the local government as a place to entertain business connections. So again, it's this weird echo of a campaign that's happening now, where government officials are essentially trying to tone down their entertainment budgets so as not to raise too much attention to how much money is actually flowing around. And so it's a similar conflict. Do you want to talk about that particular incident? It's a startling detail.
Yes, so what happened in that particular incident, this is a hotel in Chengdu called the Jinjiang Hotel. It still exists now. It's, nowadays it's quite swanky with a marble lobby and, all these very expensive shops selling Chinese designer labels that no one has ever heard of for exorbitant sums of money. But back then it wasn't so smart, but it did contain the US consulate and the Consul General's flat. So there were a lot of foreigners who had gone there to shelter in the US Consul General's flat when all the fighting began on the streets, because there were 3 days of pitched battles on the streets, and for a while the local government even lost control of the streets, the armed police, and it was always the armed police there. The military was not deployed. So the armed police had actually had to go back and shelter in a municipal compound, and people were so angry about what happened in Beijing that they had started burning down state-run property like cars and markets and cinemas to, as a protest against the state. Anyway, in the Jinjiang Hotel, the people were sheltering in the Consul General's residence, and a mob broke in for whatever reason. Possibly the US consulate at the time believed they were, as you said, targeting the stocks of liquor and alcohol, but also perhaps targeting the hotel because it represented, the huge wealth gap and official profiteering and all this kind of thing. And anyway, in
no way did I mean to suggest that they were drinkers and smokers, but this is currency and commodity. You could sell that stuff. So these are poor people, perhaps.
So the armed police were called in, and they got the situation under control, all the Westerners were told. And all the Westerners were told it was safe to go back to their rooms. And as they were going back to their rooms at the front of the hotel, out of the windows, they just saw this really startling sight in the courtyard, and for some of them it took them quite a long time to understand what they were seeing. It was all the people who had been detained, and they were lined up in rows, kneeling on the ground with their arms behind their backs.
How many people are we talking about here?
Well, it was night. It was difficult to tell, but we're talking dozens of people. When I went to the Chinese sources, they said 70 people were detained at that hotel at that time. And anyway, they had their hands tied behind their backs or wired, and as in a way that those who were watching believed they had to break their arms to do it, so to totally incapacitate these protesters. And then, quite a while passed, and then an order was given, and they were thrown, but one by one, very violently, face down on the ground. And then, one by one, the armed policemen would go round and very brutally beat them up, kick them, and use these iron bars and batons to smash their heads. And the people who were watching were convinced that they were seeing people being killed in front of their eyes. And after several hours, two trucks came in, and they saw these bodies being thrown onto the trucks. And people described it to me like slabs of meat, like sacks of potato, like garbage. Those who were watching it were sure that the bodies that they were seeing were already corpses. But at this distance, there's no way of knowing really how many people there were and what happened to them. And that's one of the problems of looking at what happened 25 years ago in a society as closed as China, is that there were some questions that it's really, really hard to find answers for. And one of those is, did those people live or die? But I was struck by the fact that the people that I spoke to, many of them didn't realize that other people had seen the same sight as them. Many of them, when after this happened, they were repatriated back to their own countries, and they were so shaken. One woman told me that she was repatriated back in such a hurry that she didn't have any clothes, and so she had to go out and buy new clothes. And it was only a year later she realized that her entire wardrobe was black. Because she was just so shaken by what she saw. She felt like she was in mourning. And many of them, they went to rights groups like Amnesty, they went to the press, like the New York Times, the ABC in Australia, the Swedish press, and they tried to tell people what they'd seen. But because they were so disparate and they never really got together, the story never came out. And because what was happening in Beijing was so overarching and so massive, and the Western press was all in Beijing. They didn't really look that far beyond Beijing. Although some did try to go to Chengdu, they never found out what had happened because all the witnesses had either gone back to their own countries or were too scared to talk. This story just never got out, and it just struck me again and again and again when I was talking to these people. They would say, I can't believe other people saw what I saw. And, after I sent them copies of the book or copies of the chapter, I got a lot of emails back saying that it had been quite a cathartic experience, and that they had felt like for years they had been living with an atrocity that they had bore witness to, but not been able to tell anybody about, and that nobody had really cared enough about it to do anything. So, all of that, I wasn't expecting to write that story, but when I stumbled across it, there wasn't really any other choice.
I was going to say, that's hard to ignore that. What we're talking about here is how human beings choose to live with pain. That's what we're talking about at some level. How do you survive a painful experience? This woman you mentioned earlier, Tan Deying, whose son was pulled from his bicycle, beaten over the head, we don't know. She, as Louisa tells us, is remarkable among all of the mothers and fathers whose children were killed in Beijing and in Chengdu and perhaps elsewhere, for having been, I believe, the only one ever to have been given a monetary compensation for her pain and loss. Can you tell us a bit about that and why that makes her different and special?
Well, when she was given that money, and it was about $9,000, she was told, this isn't compensation for the death of your son. It's a hardship allowance. And that was a kind of useful euphemism, I think, for not accepting responsibility for the death of her son.
You do a really good job of describing her. Can you tell the audience who she is? Because it's important to her direct manner of speech.
So she, when I saw her in Chengdu, I felt, she was almost like the kind of person that you would have seen 20 years before. She was like the kind of archetypal peasant farmer. She was very small, and she was sort of shuffling around in flip-flops, and she spoke with the thickest accent I have ever heard. And I really couldn't understand her. I had to get someone else to translate between us, or translate what she could understand me, but I couldn't understand her because she spoke with such a thick accent, and she had sort of wiry hair sticking out in all directions, and she'd clearly been eating a lot of garlic and had not seen a toothbrush for quite a long time. But the thing about her that is amazing is her persistence, that by herself, this woman who had had almost no education, had for the past 25 years, every day, been trying to hold the government to account, been trekking from the law courts to the police bureau to the local People's Congress to try to get answers. And she'd even been to Beijing 5 times to try to get answers about what had happened. And each time she'd been caught and sent back. She'd been beaten. She was twice put in an iron cage as punishment. And she had a police car that was stationed outside her home for 2 whole years. So this is also part of this security apparatus that we have seen, which is really one of the legacies of Tiananmen, that the government decided that this should never happen again, that they should never have such big protests that could threaten them in the same way as again. So they put in place all of this system of internal surveillance, watching people who are deemed to be a threat to state stability and stopping them from doing anything. And then one of the ways they do this is surveillance and punishment. Another of the ways is bribery. So that's why they gave her this hardship allowance. It was really an attempt to buy her off.
Did it stop her?
No. She took the money. She knew that what was meant by it. She understood that they didn't want her to petition anymore. But I mean, she's a very straightforward person. She calls the people who watch her son of a bitches. And she was like, I'm taking their money and I don't care. And I'm just going to keep it. Because they owe it to me anyway. So it didn't stop her in the slightest.
I was really moved by her story, and it put me in mind of, here's a woman who's trying to commemorate her son who died at age 17. I have a 10-year-old daughter who grew up in Beijing and is now in Brooklyn for a year, and she's learning in Brooklyn Public School about slavery. And in 5th or 6th grade, they'll learn about apartheid. And certainly we know about the Holocaust. These are national shames that countries around the world have dealt with, are dealing with still, and do so in free discussion and debate. You've got a 9-year-old, you've got a 6-year-old. You've lived in China, they've grown up there. Have you ever talked to them about this? Did they know what you were doing with this book?
They do know now. When I started writing the book, I didn't tell them for quite a long time because I was nervous about the sensitivity of a subject like this. I was nervous that they might blurt something out, and I didn't want
Blurt it out where?
Anywhere really, but I lived and I worked in a diplomatic compound, and these are widely believed to be bugged. So I didn't ever talk about the book at home. I never talked about it in the office. I never talked about it on the telephone. I never emailed anyone about it. So halfway through, when I decided to write a different book to the book that was in my proposal, I didn't tell my editor, who is sitting over there, my very patient editor, Tim, I didn't tell him for months and months and months. In fact, until I went back to Hong Kong and I felt that it was safe to talk about the book, because I didn't want to endanger the project, and I certainly didn't want to put the people that I was talking to in any more jeopardy than they already were.
But how do you explain it to children? And this segues into, how does China explain it to next generation? And
well, China doesn't explain it to the next generation. There's no kind of explanation.
But Chinese parents, these people who you've done so much work with.
Well, I mean, Chinese kids in schools today, they won't learn about 1989. It's not on the syllabus at all. In university, they might learn, but only if you're a history major, and the amount of teaching material is extraordinarily short. So I had a history book that they use, and out of 529 pages, only 4 were about the events of 1989. And what was interesting was some of the details in them were completely incorrect. It was a false account. I mean, it was so wrong that one French historian said that it contained a monumental historical untruth. So basically, if they are taught about it's not accurate information. But
I think the official death toll is 256 in Beijing, and the numbers that are widely believed otherwise are what now?
It's much higher. Nobody knows a true number, but it could be anything up to a couple of thousand. But that wasn't surprising to me that it is not taught in schools, given the amount of effort there is at keeping a lid on discussions. What was surprising to me was that it's not talked about in homes, even amongst those that were most affected and those who were most instrumental in the protests, because it's just deemed to be too dangerous. So people believe, I can put myself at risk, but my child, now that's another matter. So there was one particular man who I interviewed who's an artist. His name is Sheng Qi, and he wasn't in Tiananmen Square on June the 4th, but he was very, very sympathetic to the students. And but he went back to his hometown, and then when he heard what had happened in Tiananmen Square, he was just so horrified. He said it was almost as if he lost his mind for an instant. He was sort of insane with kind of anger and fear, and he had this sort of crazy moment, and he took a meat cleaver and he chopped off his little finger as an act of protest. And then, for years afterwards, he used that in his artwork. It was always the hand, the mutilated hand. It was a political statement, this mutilated hand. And you would see pictures of his hand holding photographs and named things like Myself and History and things like that. But what surprised me was when I asked him what he told his 12-year-old son about it, he said, oh, well, I'm always making up these funny stories. I tell him that I left it on the bus. And I said, well, surely he doesn't believe that. And he said, no, well, he doesn't believe it, but I don't want to tell him the truth because he's just a little kid, and I think he needs protection. So it was really stunning to me that it's a fact that is a truth that is deemed so dangerous to people that they have to protect their children from it.
Not only their children, you just put me in mind of another gentleman you interviewed who was, I believe, number 19 on the most wanted list. This is a guy called Zhang Ming, who was an organizer of the protests in Beijing, and like Sheng Qi, who carries with him a physical reminder of his anger at that time and place. Zhang Ming has another interesting habit that he picked up after 89, and that has to do with his diet. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I would call it an interesting habit.
Sorry.
I think that's a
callous, yes, I strike that from the record.
But he was in prison for the first time after the protests, and he saw how those who'd been in prison before, how they used refusing food as a tool. It was really the only tool that they had available to them. And so after he was released from prison...
A tool for what?
Well, a tool to resist. And after he was released from prison, he wanted to get away from the whole legacy of having been a counter-revolutionary. So he started a business, and he changed his name, and he went into business, and he was wildly, wildly successful, too successful. And then he found himself in jail again on these sort of wildly trumped-up charges. And it was clear that this time, the sentence was much longer than the first sentence. And he realized that he could use the lessons that he'd learned the first time round. So he simply stopped eating. And he didn't eat. I think it was 2006 that he was in jail. And he starved himself, except of milk, until he was on the point of death. And they didn't want him to die in jail because that would look really bad. So they released him home, and he got home, and he discovered that he had lost the capacity to actually process food. So to this day, he doesn't eat solid food. He can eat, but he actually subsists on a diet of milk. And he's very, very thin. And he has all of these physical problems that were caused by beatings in jail. And he was treated the first time, particularly, really so appallingly, because one of the other way that they resisted was that there were these prison regulations that prisoners were meant to recite and to learn, commit to memory. And he and some of the other prisoners decided that they would not allow their minds to be polluted by that. Their minds were theirs alone. And so they refused. And that was why they were beaten, and they were shocked with electric batons. And, he was really very, very badly beaten. And I think, in a way, that's what is so stunning to me, that these most private of spaces, these spaces within your own head, like memory, are becoming used as a political tool, and that is still happening today.
I think it's telling that he's chosen to homeschool his children.
Yes, well, he has really tried to withdraw from any arena where any kind of state education or ideology could affect his children. He doesn't want them exposed to any of that.
His wife is some 20 years younger than he. She was 4 years old when 89 happened, and there's a part in the book where you and she are talking, and you ask her what it's like to be with him, and tell us what she says, because I think it's quite telling about how people who are too young to have remembered it themselves interact with the memory and the history of it. And then his reaction to her is also fascinating to me.
Well, to her, it's interesting because 1989 means nothing at all. She feels like it's something that has nothing to do with her. It's completely unconnected to her. And what was interesting was that he also understands this. So he said, because she was only 4 in 1989, she has no memory of what happened then. And he said that he doesn't talk to her about 1989 because it's just too far removed from her. And she has no interest in it. And it's not that it's too sensitive, it's just that it's at such a distance. And that was something that I heard again and again. I mean, there was this kid on a university campus in the south of China who said to me, I don't have a view on 1989 because, I was too young and I'm not a historian or an archaeologist. And to him, something that happened 25 years ago is like archaeology. It's ancient history. And Jiang Ming said there's no point in always harping back to 1989 to try to influence people, because to young people today, it means nothing.
It's a somewhat counterintuitive belief for someone who spent so much time in prison. It was startling, but his mode of survival, it seems to me, is reliant largely on, as I think he told you, on his Taoist thinking. Here we are again talking about how do humans survive pain, and I wonder, a couple of weeks ago, Oliver Stone, the Hollywood director, was in Beijing at the Beijing International Film Festival, and in a panel discussion, he said, China's movie business, which is blowing up and getting lots of attention in Hollywood because there are so many people who have money now to go to the theaters. He said, you'll only ever be able to export movies, I'm paraphrasing here, and really become a global power in the movie business if you're willing to make an unflinching biopic of Chairman Mao. And that leads me to the way we've dealt with our own history. Whatever you think about Oliver Stone's grasp of American history, which some people believe is tenuous at best, there are lots of films that deal with history through humor. And it's a dark question to ask whether, we'll ever hear a Tiananmen joke the way we've heard Holocaust jokes or slavery jokes, as distasteful as they may seem. I wonder whether in your experience you ever did hear a Tiananmen joke.
I never heard a Tiananmen joke. I don't know if they exist. It may be too raw and too taboo a subject to have jokes about. I guess the nearest thing would be these internet memes that we see, because you cannot talk about June the 4th on the internet. So netizens, it's censored. The Chinese internet is very heavily policed. So people who are online find different ways of referring to June the 4th. First it was May the 35th, but then that was shut down. March the 96th, I heard, was the other day. And this year there were all kinds. I don't know if you saw it, but there was one picture that someone had posted that went viral for a while, and it was a photograph of Tiananmen Square, and you could see someone holding up two sets of playing cards, and the top line of playing cards read 8964 in black, which if you read it in Chinese is the way you say June the 4th, 89, and the second line in red said AK-47.
Ace, King, 47. Yeah. It's a startling one. And there have been others. The famous Tank Man image of a man whose name we still don't know, who stood in front of a column of tanks on Chang'an, the Avenue of Eternal Peace in the entrance to Tiananmen Square, was what do you call it? There's now an internet meme where you get little rubber duckies moving along in a column with a tank in front of it. The New York Times ran an op-ed piece the other day. This is not an internet meme, but an image that is speaking about the way people deal with this memory, where the tank was being stopped by two women with shopping bags. And this is talking about people being more interested in, this was accompanied a piece by Helen Gull. I don't know if you saw that one. It's a remarkable reflection on how people are more interested at this moment in sort of the comforts of life, not wanting to think back to that painful moment. Listen, we've spoken for 50 minutes. Thank you for bearing with us. I'd like to open it up for questions, but we've also been joined by a very special guest this evening, Chen Guancheng, Lao Chen, 欢迎你. Question? Would you like to ask that question?
Yeah, I'll ask. Yeah. So for those of you who do not know Mr. Chen, he is a self-taught lawyer who caused something of a diplomatic incident in 2012 when Hillary Clinton was visiting China. Mr. Chen had exposed forced abortions and family planning abuses in his province in Linyi, and had been kept under very, very strict house arrest and beaten for a long time, and he escaped from that during Hillary Clinton's visit and took shelter in the US embassy in Beijing, and is now here in the US. And just a couple of days ago, Mr. Chen gave his first speech in English talking about June the 4th, and in it he said he urged the US government to take action. He said, "Stop receiving the June the 4th incident criminals as your honored guests. Don't let those who crush human rights enter your free democratic countries. Deny them the warmth of your handshake, the warmth of your smile. Evildoers won't stop until they are held responsible." So I wondered if we could ask him a question, and we'll translate in a minute. In a world where China is the second largest economy, is that the best solution, or would such a confrontational approach really, could it be counterproductive?
要我说中文吗？OK，
我就是说，你当天关于6·4的想法呢？就是说不要让这些6·4的这些你所谓6·4犯罪人到这些国家来当这些嘉宾。然后我想问你，这个在现在的世界，中国是世界第2个大经济，这真的是最好的方式吗？或者这个是不是会有一些不好的反应？
我想是这样啊，世界现在越来越多是属于人民的，而不是某一个政府的，尤其是我们的自由政府啊，它必须代表我们人民的利益。就像美国人民如果有这样的要求，那么美国政府是不能考虑到短暂的经济利益而牺牲我们长期的人权价值。
等一下，我先翻译这些，好吧？
谢谢。
So he said, in a world, this is a world that belongs to people, not governments. In a country like America, where the people are in charge, the people should require that the US government does not submit to short-term economic concerns. 等会再继续吧。
我想呢，这个与一个犯罪集团来拉近关系，这用大家我们最普通的标准来衡量，这是一件光荣的事情吗？如果一个6·4的屠夫在美国受到贵宾一样的待遇，抗议者都被支在一边，大家觉得这个符合我们美国民主自由人权的立国之本吗？这显然是不能被接受的。
So he said that having a group of criminals coming here to use their connections violates some of our most basic values. Is it right? Is it in line with US freedoms and concepts of universal rights that these people should come here as honored guests? Surely that should be something that we can't accept.
I'd like to put this to the rest of this audience. Does anybody have an opinion about this, or would like to ask Louisa a question?
Or Mr. Chen.
Or Mr. Chen.
谢谢你的，谢谢。
Yeah. Please identify yourself, and there's a microphone coming around.
I'll try to speak loud enough.
Here you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Adrian. So this is a question for you. I haven't read the book, obviously, but I'm curious, what do you think, first of all, the difficulties you've encountered as a foreigner writing this history in terms of, first of all, like the process of writing it? I mean, like acquiring evidence and like actually getting into the story. And second of all, I suppose the tone of the story, like you're telling, like, do you feel any difficulty actually getting the same tone as, say, someone who've experienced the same mystery or is Chinese or have gone through all that, writing the same book? Like, what's the difference there?
It's a difficult question to answer. I guess the first thing that I would say is maybe I wouldn't have written this book if there was a Chinese person who could write it. You know, it would be great if people could tell their own stories, but in many cases, these people who I talk about, they've written their stories down, but there's no way they can get published in China today. So I tried to stay as close as I could to the things that they told me. And in terms of tone, I tried very hard to always speak with people who were in the same place at the same time, people who were there, so that my tone, so that it was familiar. But one of the problems that I came across, there were all kinds of difficulties. One of the problems was the problem of memory, because 25 years has passed and people's memories are completely mutable and vulnerable to all kind of influences. And I discovered this when I talked to student leaders who had stayed in China and student leaders had left. And sometimes they were in the square at the same time describing the same incident, but they would have a completely different take on it. So, for the student leaders in exile, often they remembered the kind of triumphant aspects of the student movement. They remembered, having been in the square. It was like a carnival of ideas. They were winning. They were hearing their words being echoed out of the mouth of some of the top officials. It seemed like they were going to win. But then you hear the same events remembered by someone who still lives in China, and all they could see was the crushing inevitability of the crackdown. So, memories are really shaped by geography. And that was something that surprised me, the extent to which the same things were remembered totally differently. In terms of access, that was really hard. I mean, in China, there's no access to any of these documents. In fact, being overseas, here in the US, I think you have access to a lot more information in Chinese about the events at that time. I mean, I think, in fact, a lot of this stuff is hidden in university libraries here in the States, and it's not actually hidden, it's just sitting there waiting to be discovered. It's just that people haven't sort of gone through it, and maybe historians tend to steer clear of things like 89 and June the 4th, because it's so controversial that those topics, if you study them in great detail, you may find that you're not allowed a visa to go back to China. So I think from that perspective, being a foreigner, knowing how to navigate university libraries, being able to find these documents, from that perspective, it was possibly slightly helpful.
In the back there?
Hey, thanks so much. It's an amazing book. Congratulations, Louisa, and thanks for a very interesting talk tonight. I have just two really quick questions.
Could you tell us your name?
Sorry, my name's Phelim Kine. My first question is, under what circumstances do you foresee at all the Chinese government being able to come to grips with Tiananmen? You note in the introduction to your book that the government of Xi Jinping, who was sort of heralded as a reformer, is becoming even more lacks even more tolerance than his predecessors. So where might this change? And my second question sort of riffs off of Chen Guangcheng's comment. This war on memory, or this enforced amnesia, has active and passive complicity amongst some foreign governments. I note that on June 4th, statements by both the government of France and the EU refused to use the word Tiananmen. They referenced obliquely events of 25 years ago. I just wonder what you have to say about that type of complicity. Thank you.
I mean, in terms of when the Chinese Communist Party will come to grips with its past, I wish I had a crystal ball. I hope there will be a time. But I don't think that we are any closer to a reassessment of Tiananmen. In fact, I think it seems like we're further away from it than ever before. When Xi Jinping came to power in November 2012, it became clear really very quickly that he wasn't going to reevaluate even things that happened under Chairman Mao, let alone more recent history. And you know, when they issued a document called the 7 Unmentionables, the things that university professors were not allowed to talk about, the historical mistakes of the Communist Party was on there. And I think what we saw this year, the level of repression, sends a very clear message. And the message is, anyone who talks about 1989, anyone who remembers Tiananmen in an interview with a Western journalist can end up in jail. And you know, next year, I don't know, I would suspect that we will see far fewer people willing to talk about their memories of that time, because there clearly is a price to pay. So I don't see any kind of reevaluation happening at any time in the near future.
I'll just interject that the only even slightly humorous thing I've seen about this year is from our beloved The Onion. If anybody missed it, you should look it up. It's the headline was China observes Chinese citizens observe. Thank you. Chinese citizens observe a 25-year moment of silence. What was the second question? Louisa wants to know. Phelim?
Do you want to ask it?
Yeah, my second, it was more as a question observation, but the fact that that governments are in many ways actively complicit with this amnesia by not referencing, not bringing up Tiananmen specifically in the last couple of days, with regards to what Chen Guangcheng said, for economic reasons and catering to Chinese government's quote unquote sensitivities.
I might just add, if anybody didn't notice, Barack Obama in Warsaw speaking there on the anniversary of democratic elections 25 years ago did in fact mention Tiananmen by name in the same breath. So as a bit of contrast, there's somebody who's out there talking about it.
Well, the US government does every year pretty much issue a statement where it calls on China to release anyone still in prison because of 1989 and to issue a truthful accounting of what happened. And every year this is greeted with sort of very predictable vitriol from the Chinese Foreign Ministry that accuses the US of meddling in their foreign affairs and this kind of thing. So, I mean, I think there are many Chinese human rights defenders who feel that they've been very badly let down by Western governments, and particularly when the US took the decision to hive off human rights dialogue and hold it separately, not as a part of its other dealings with the Chinese government. I think a lot of people felt quite betrayed by that.
We've got time for 2 more questions.
Hi,
there in the
Louisa.
center of the black sleeve.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I think you...
We'll go first, then we'll come. Sorry.
There we go. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Diane, and we just saw an influx of articles, hundreds of articles about Tiananmen written by every newspaper around the world, pictures on the internet, all these things, which is really exciting, but knowing that in China, no one is really seeing that unless you can jump the Great Firewall. And the government has been able to suppress all these things. Well, we're seeing them. If you had a crystal ball, which we're going to pretend you do, what would be the thing you think that would crack that government and allow democracy to come to China with your crystal ball?
Well, that's a really hard question. I mean, I wish I had that crystal ball. All I can say is that I do think the government itself is so insecure and nervous, you're always wondering, what are they worrying about that we don't know? It's now the world's second largest economy. You know, you've got $4 trillion in reserves, and yet you're running around putting little old grannies in prison for trying to remember their dead children. So to them, you know, what happened in the past is clearly still a major, major threat. But then when you add to that all the sort of whole constellation of issues that people are protesting about now, which will be the one I wish I knew. I mean, you know, it's interesting now, we've seen so many very large protests on environmental issues, on polluting power plants, so many you know, the ethnic unrest as well, which is almost becoming an insurgency in Xinjiang. And then, you know, tiny isolated protests every day about land seizures and local corruption. All of these are tiny little fires that the government is doing its best to put out and desperately hoping that they don't join together. Yet the sum total of this repression is leading to more protests. So we are seeing a vicious spiral of repression, really. But what will be the thing, I don't know.
If I could boldly just jump in and answer, I believe that the internet will out the truth, that there's no way. Even you said you can't get information unless you jump the Great Firewall. Well, my strong belief, my father-in-law teaches at Tsinghua University, and my feeling is that if you have access to a teenager in China, you can jump that firewall very, very easily. It's not a problem. Every one of his students from all corners of China show up in Beijing, and they know how to get over the firewall, and they know how to read. It's really more a question of when they read what they're reading from the outside press, which is regularly I used to have articles of mine translated into Chinese before they had hit my parents' stoop in Los Angeles. You know, in the newspaper, they were up on the internet in Chinese because somebody had an interest in what we were writing.
But were they articles about politics or not? I would.
Sometimes. I mean, I wrote largely about sort of fluffy things like movies, but a lot of times there were plenty of politics in that, and indeed, they would get blocked only every so often because they were not dealing directly with Tiananmen. But my feeling is that.
I mean, to an extent, I would agree with you. And the dissident Liu Xiaobo said the internet is God's gift to China. So, I mean, I think it brings the potential to enlighten people, but the thing is that young people who are using those technologies, who've got access to them, they're not really interested in history or politics. That was another of the big lessons of 89. Stay away from politics. It's bad for you. So that, you know, when I went to the universities with the picture of Tank Man, only 15 out of 100 people knew what it was. And it wasn't that the others couldn't find out. All of these kids could. They're the smartest kids in China. It was just they didn't care about it. They felt it was nothing to do with them.
Do you think that's a function of who was asking the question?
I don't think it was a function of who was asking the question, because you could tell the people who were lying. You could see from their response, if they really didn't know what this picture was, they just looked completely blank. If they knew, you could see fear, tightening, or they would just say, I'm sorry, I can't talk to you, I'm busy, and run off really, really, really fast. So I don't think it was a function of who they were talking to, no.
There's a great illustration of what Louisa's describing on, if I can do a shameless plug for ChinaFile.
Yes.
We put up a video yesterday, which we found on the internet. It's out there on Vimeo. It was shot in 2005 by a filmmaker in Beijing who went to the gate of Beijing University and then also to Tiananmen Square with a video camera and simply asks, do you know what today is? He does it on June 4th. And he asks over and over again, countless people, dozens of people. The video lasts about 13 minutes. And he simply says, do you know what day today is? And some people sort of can't remember what day it is and genuinely don't know. And others say, oh, I know why you're asking. I'm sorry, I've got an appointment to run to. Or I don't want to talk about that. Not one person in this whole video where he's clearly spent the whole day, goes in from dawn to dusk, gives him a straight answer. So there's a great reluctance to engage. And this was a Chinese person. One asks him, what's your danwei? What's your work group? There's great suspicion about who's asking the question and what repercussions there might be there. You can see that video on ChinaFile.com. We have time for one more question right here in the front row, please.
Thank you. So actually my question was
Could you tell us your name, please?
My name is Du Ying. I was actually born in the year 1989. So going back to what we were discussing just now, because I myself, I have no knowledge of this event from school, and I only vaguely remember adults mention it once or twice growing up as a kid. So I was just wondering, while you were working on this book, have you ever get to talk to the younger generation who might have some knowledge of this event, and what's their opinion of it?
I did. I talked to people at the universities, and among those who did know what had happened, I found that really quite a lot of people were very defensive of the actions of the government. It was quite popular, widespread reaction was kind of to spring to the government's defense, something along the lines of, some people said, what the government did was wrong, but all countries have dirty laundries. You know, your government has also done lots of terrible things. Why are you picking on us? That was one reaction. Another reaction was to really talk about to use this retrospective justification that China has had 3 decades of really high-speed growth, and that life has changed so much, and people are much richer than they were in 1989, and that China's now the world's 2nd largest economy, and that this shows that the government's actions back then, however difficult to take, were correct. So I think that's really almost an echo of the government line that we've heard from the foreign ministry time and time again, that China's success today stems back to the decisions made by the government. It's also the view that we heard from the chairman of Alibaba, Jack Ma, who many young Chinese people absolutely worship as a god, who said that Deng Xiaoping's decision to crack down was regrettable, I think, but correct. And I just wanted to ask you, when you left China and you came out and you started reading about it, what did you think? What do you think now?
I think at the very beginning, my experience, I was very startled to learn of the importance of this event. I think at that time I was just know too little about this to comprehend the scale of this event, what actually happened. So I think I'm still trying to digest that, and I think it's a regret that so few of my peers, they actually have real concerns of this issue. They may have heard of it. For those, like you said, they know it's out there in the internet. If they're here in the States, they can have access. If they're in China, they can cross the firewall or whatever. But it's just, they don't, like, we are here, we care about this issue, we're discussing it, but those people who are, the large number of people who are still in China, who their parents' generation may be strongly affected by this event. They have virtually no knowledge of this. That's what I find the most regretful.
This brings to mind just a quick tangent. My wife was an Associated Press reporter in Beijing for the time we were there, and she once went to Kaifeng because she'd found, or rather her news assistant, a Chinese colleague at the AP, had found a chat group of people who were born on June 4th, 1989. and in searching their birth date, discovered that their birth date was blacked out from the internet, and had then found one another by the dozens to ask, what's wrong with me? Why is my birthday blacked out? So we went to Kaifeng and met this kid. This was 5 years ago at the 20th anniversary, and sat with him and explained why his birth date was blacked out. We were literally, as far as we could tell, or I was along for the ride with my then 5-year-old daughter, explaining what it was about his birthday. And he was a graphic designer, and he used computers, and he understood the internet. It wasn't quite what it was. But Kaifeng is not a giant city in China. It's not a small city by American standards. But he then went to his father, who had worked at the university there and had protested the night he was born. And we witnessed him telling his son this for the first time. It was remarkable that his father had kept that news from him. Just, perhaps it was too painful to remember that night. It was very bittersweet.
Well, I mean, I think that brings to mind what one Chinese dissident, Cui Wei-ping, said. And she said that as time goes on and people don't talk about June the 4th, the crimes of the state really become the crime of silence. And the crime of silence is a crime in which almost everyone is participating.
I think that's a very good note to say thank you to Louisa Lim for coming. Her book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited, is published by Oxford University Press. We encourage you to buy it at the back. Louisa will sign it for you. Thanks to the Strand for having both of us, and please visit ChinaFile.com.
Yeah, once again, also thank you on behalf of the Strand so much, Louisa and Jonathan, for joining us tonight. ChinaFile was instrumental, as was Oxford University Press, in making this evening happen tonight. So thank you so much, and you all take care. Have a good evening.